My name is Claire. I am 33 years old and a senior forensic auditor, and I want you to picture something before I begin. Picture the exact face of the person you trust the most in this entire world. Picture their eyes, their smile, the way they hold your hand when you're afraid. Now picture that same face looking directly at you while you are bleeding on the floor of a broken elevator, 7 months pregnant with their child and choosing to save someone else. Not a stranger. Not a child. His 26-year-old mistress. That was the last image I saw before the emergency hatch slammed shut above me and left me in the dark to die. 8 hours earlier, I walked into my husband's skyscraper as a wife. 8 hours later, I crawled out of it as something far more dangerous. My husband David is a Seattle tech chief executive officer who was 14 days away from becoming a billionaire. He kicked me in the shoulder with his heavy leather shoe. He climbed over my pregnant body. He hauled his young lover to safety first. And when he strutted into the lobby covered in fake soot, performing grief for the news cameras, his own chief financial officer walked up to him with a single sealed envelope in his hand. What was inside that envelope destroyed his entire empire in under 90 seconds, and he still has no idea that the quiet woman he left bleeding in the dark was the one who put it there. If you have ever been abandoned by the one person who swore to protect you in the exact moment your life was on the line, drop the name of your city in the comments right now so I know you are here with me. Smash that subscribe button and hit like, because what I did to David over the next 6 months will make your hands shake. Stay with me until the very end, because the final sentence I whispered to him on his knees in front of 100 cameras is something you will replay in your head for weeks. My life, before that Tuesday, looked like a magazine cover. I was married to David, a 35-year-old tech visionary and the chief executive officer of the most hyped software startup in Seattle. We lived in a glass house overlooking the Puget Sound. From the outside, we were untouchable. David was brilliant, charismatic, and starving for more. His company was 14 days from ringing the bell on the NASDAQ and turning him into a billionaire overnight. He walked the streets of Seattle in custom suits like he already owned the pavement. Journalists called him the next great American founder. What the journalists did not know, and what David himself never suspected, was that his entire empire was built on a lie he could not even see. 3 years earlier, his startup had been quietly bleeding to death. Servers were about to be shut off. Payroll was 2 weeks from bouncing. In that exact moment, a silent angel investor appeared out of nowhere with a $15 million injection through a blind trust managed by a corporate law firm. David bragged for years about the anonymous whale he had personally reeled in. He never once suspected the whale was his quiet, analytical wife. I am a senior forensic auditor. Hiding money is what I do for a living. I structured every wire so it could never be traced back to me. I did it because I loved him. I did it because I wanted to protect his fragile ego. I did it because I truly believed we were building a life together. I was 7 months pregnant with our first child. The marriage had grown cold in the months leading up to the initial public offering. David was never home. When he was home, his phone never left his hand. He blamed crisis management. He blamed his new public relations director. Her name was Savannah. She was 26 years old. She was always at his side at every event. She smiled at me the way a cat smiles at a wounded bird. I told myself it was pregnancy hormones. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the man I loved would never. That was the lie that almost killed me and my daughter. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in Seattle. I had 2 routine tax documents that needed his signature. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, just paperwork. I walked into his skyscraper with one hand resting protectively on my belly. The receptionist waved me through. I took the express elevator to the executive floor. I had absolutely no idea I was walking into the last morning of my old life. I found David near the executive suite, standing far too close to Savannah. When they saw me, they jumped apart. Savannah smoothed her skirt with a smile, so fake it made my stomach turn. David glanced at his watch with irritation. He snatched the tax documents from my hand, barely reading them, and scribbled his name across the signature line. He shoved them back at me and marched toward the elevator bank without a word. But I needed a second signature from his financial officer on the 42nd floor. So I followed. Savannah slipped in behind him, carrying a stack of press releases. 2 young interns rushed in at the last second, balancing coffee trays. The heavy metal doors slid shut. 6 people inside a polished steel cabin. The digital display climbed, 20th floor, 30th floor. I watched their reflection in the mirrored doors. David and Savannah were looking at each other in a way a husband should never look at another woman, while his pregnant wife stands 3 feet behind him. My chest tightened. Something inside me whispered, "You already know." Then at the 40th floor, the sound came. It was not a bang. It was a snap. A single violent crack like a steel whip, lashing the walls of the shaft. The digital display flickered and died. The floor vanished from underneath us. We were falling. The interns screamed. Coffee exploded across the ceiling. My stomach lifted into my throat. Air roared past the cabin like a hurricane. We dropped 1 story, 2 stories, 3, 4, 5. My hand flew to my belly. In that endless moment, I did not think about David. I did not think about Savannah. I thought only of the tiny heartbeat inside me, and I whispered, "Please, please, please." Then the emergency brakes clamped down. The steel calipers bit into the guide rails with a violent crunch that threw every single one of us to the floor. Sparks showered down the glass. Metal shrieked. And then the lights died. Absolute blackness. I hit the floor hard. I twisted at the last second so my shoulder took the impact instead of my stomach. Pain exploded through my collarbone. A hot, searing contraction ripped across my lower abdomen. I curled into a fetal position, gasping. The ventilation had died with the power. The air was already thickening. And then I felt it. A warm, slow dampness spreading between my thighs. I was bleeding. Panic clawed up my throat. I reached out into the darkness, sweeping the filthy floor with my palm, whispering, "David, David, please. I need you." I dragged myself forward, inch by inch. My fingers brushed the edge of a wool suit jacket. Relief flooded me so hard I almost sobbed out loud. I reached up to grab his sleeve, and at that exact second, a sickly green emergency light flickered on in the ceiling panel. The dim glow lit up the nightmare beside me. David was not looking for me. David was not calling my name. David was huddled in the corner of the cabin with his arms wrapped fiercely around Savannah. He was shielding her body with his own. He was stroking her hair. He pulled her face against his chest. He kissed her forehead. And in a soft, trembling voice I had not heard him use in years, he whispered, "I have got you. You are safe." I lay on the metal floor, pregnant, bleeding, 6 feet away. He did not look at me. He did not turn his head. He did not even ask if I was alive. I pulled my hand back from his jacket, slowly, silently. I bit down on my lower lip until I tasted copper because I refused to let him hear me scream. Something in my chest cracked open in that green glow, and something colder rushed in to fill the space. Because in that moment, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The man I built my life around had already chosen. And he had not chosen me. The elevator groaned above us. And somewhere in the black shaft above our heads, a single strand of the main cable let go with a distant metallic ping. We were not done falling yet. 8 hours passed inside that suffocating metal coffin. Every minute felt like a lifetime. The temperature climbed until sweat poured down my temples and pooled at the small of my back. Condensation ran down the mirrored walls like the elevator itself was crying. My contractions came in slow, uneven waves, sometimes 10 minutes apart, sometimes 3. I tore a strip from my blouse and pressed it between my legs to slow the bleeding. Across the cabin, David and Savannah stayed tangled together in the corner, whispering to each other in the dark. Once, and only once, David finally glanced in my direction. His eyes met mine for less than a second. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask about the baby. He simply pulled Savannah closer and turned his face away. The 2 interns huddled on the opposite wall, too traumatized to notice the second tragedy playing out 3 feet from them. Then the smell came. Burning rubber. Melting plastic. Somewhere below us, in the shaft, an electrical fire had begun to feed. Thick gray smoke started seeping up through the seams in the floor. The interns began coughing. The younger one banged on the doors, screaming for help until her voice tore. My eyes burned, my throat closed. I covered my face with the collar of my jacket and forced shallow breaths for my daughter, and then above us, thunder. Heavy boots on the roof of the car, sparks raining down through the vents, a rotary saw screamed through the reinforced ceiling hatch, the metal peeled back like the lid of a can. A flashlight beam cut through the smoke and a soot-streaked firefighter shouted down into the cabin, "The main cable is fracturing. We can only hoist one person at a time. Women and the pregnant lady come up first." I pushed myself up. My legs shook, my hand reached for the light, and that was when David lunged. His shoulder slammed into my chest with the full weight of his body. I flew backward and crashed against the steel wall. My skull cracked against metal. I slid down to the floor gasping. Before I could even understand what had happened, David had grabbed Savannah by the waist and was shoving her upward toward the open hatch. "Take Savannah first," he screamed at the rescuers, his voice cracking with performative panic. "She has severe asthma. She cannot breathe." Savannah did not have asthma. Savannah had never had asthma. The firefighters could not see through the smoke. They grabbed her outstretched arms and hauled her up. The elevator lurched. Another cable strand snapped somewhere above us. David did not wait for the harness to come back down. He jumped. He grabbed the edges of the cut hatch. He pulled himself up. I reached one hand toward him from the floor, crying his name, begging him. In his frantic scramble upward, his heavy leather shoe swung out and connected with my shoulder in a brutal kick that sent white light exploding across my vision. He hauled his upper body through the opening. He looked down at me, bleeding, pregnant, choking on smoke, his own child inside me. He said, "I will make them come back for you." Then the hatch slammed shut, and the darkness swallowed me whole. The metallic echo of that hatch closing vibrated to the floorboards under my hip. For a long moment, I did not move. I could not move. The smoke pressed against my skin like a hot, damp hand. The interns were sobbing somewhere behind me. Somewhere far above, I could hear David's fake grief already spinning up. I heard him shouting for someone to save my wife. "Save my wife. My wife is still down there." Tears streamed down my face. Silent, hot, furious tears. They mixed with sweat and soot and blood. And then they stopped. Because lying on that filthy floor, with my hand pressed against my daughter, something inside me went cold and very, very still. The weeping wife died in that elevator. I felt her leave my body like a spirit passing through. What replaced her did not cry. What replaced her did not beg. What replaced her was a forensic auditor who had spent her entire career tearing apart the financial lives of men, exactly like David. He thought he left behind a soft, dependent, pregnant wife who would quietly die and solve his problems. He had no idea he had just handed a weapon to a woman who knew exactly where every one of his bodies was buried. I sat up. I steadied my breathing. I ordered the interns to lie flat where the air was cooler. I pressed my back to the wall and I calculated, and that was the exact moment a rotary saw exploded through the side doors of the cabin. A secondary rescue team had breached from the hallway. Hands reached in. They pulled the interns first. Then a firefighter grabbed my arms and I threw myself through the gap. The second my boots hit the concrete of the hallway floor, a deafening snap reverberated through the entire building. The main cable let go. The elevator plunged 40 floors into the basement with a boom that shook dust from the ceiling tiles. I lay on the concrete coughing, staring into the black shaft where I was supposed to be entombed. Paramedics swarmed me. They tried to strap me to a gurney. They shouted about fetal monitoring. They tried to slide an oxygen mask over my face. I pushed every one of them away because I understood something they did not. If I was rolled out through that lobby on a stretcher, David would own the narrative. He would clutch my hand for the cameras. He would kiss my forehead. He would weep. He would spin the elevator into his personal hero arc and ride it straight into his billionaire IPO. I refused. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket. The screen was cracked. It worked. I dialed my brother Ryan, former military intelligence, private extraction specialist. He answered on the first ring. I did not cry. I did not explain. I gave him coordinates. I told him I was bleeding. I told him to get me out of this building without a single soul knowing. Ryan asked no questions. His voice dropped into a tactical calm and he told me to reach the adjacent rooftop helipad in 5 minutes. I forced myself to my feet. Adrenaline masked the fire in my ribs. I bypassed the chaos of the main evacuation route and slipped into a restricted executive corridor I had mapped during a forensic audit of the building 2 years earlier. I crossed the glass sky bridge into the neighboring high-rise like a ghost. When I forced open the fire doors to the rooftop, the roar of rotor blades was already cutting through the storm. A sleek, unmarked medical helicopter touched down. 2 tactical medics in gear jumped out before the skids fully settled. They strapped me to a stretcher, shielding my belly from the biting wind. They loaded me into the aircraft. I looked down through the window as we lifted. Below me the streets bloomed with red and blue lights, news vans, fire trucks, ambulances. Somewhere in that circus, David was tearing his shirt and smearing soot on his forehead, getting ready to give the performance of his life. He thought he had buried his biggest secret in the rubble. He had no idea his biggest secret was rising into the sky above him at 140 miles per hour. Down on the ground floor, David was already in position. He had wiped a dark streak of soot across his forehead like an artist signing a canvas. He had torn the collar of his custom shirt just enough to look heroic. Savannah sat on the bumper of an ambulance 20 feet away, wrapped in a silver thermal blanket, forcing dramatic wheezing coughs into an oxygen mask for the cameras. They had rehearsed this narrative on the way down through the ceiling hatch. They had it timed to the minute. 3 camera crews surrounded David. He ran trembling fingers through his perfectly styled hair. He looked directly into the local news lens. His voice shook with manufactured grief. He told them the smoke was too thick. He told them he had fought tooth and nail to hold on to his pregnant wife. He told them the rescue team had dragged him up against his will. He wiped a dry eye. He begged the firefighters to let him go back inside. It was flawless. It was award-winning. It was the kind of performance that would carry his stock valuation into the stratosphere. And then his eyes scanned the lobby and landed on Mitchell. Mitchell was David's chief financial officer. A quiet, older man in a pristine trench coat. What David did not know and had never once suspected was that Mitchell had worked for me for 8 years before I quietly maneuvered him into that chief financial position 3 years ago. To David, Mitchell was a bean counter. To me, Mitchell was my inside man. David broke away from the reporters and stormed across the wet marble floor. The cameras followed him hungrily. He grabbed the lapels of Mitchell's coat and shook him. He projected his voice so every microphone in a 15-foot radius would catch it. "Where is my wife?" he screamed. "Have they pulled her out? Where is Claire?" Mitchell did not react. He did not flinch. He simply peeled David's shaking hands off his coat, 1 finger at a time, and then brushed off his shoulders as if David had transferred a disease. The reporters leaned in. The lobby went quiet. Mitchell reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He pressed it firmly against David's chest. "She left on a private medevac 20 minutes ago," Mitchell said in a cold, metallic voice. "And she asked me to give you this, your divorce papers, and a Securities and Exchange Commission subpoena for financial fraud. You are finished, David." David's jaw fell open. The color drained from his face until his fake soot smears looked absurd against his ghost-white skin. His fingers trembled for real for the first time. He tore open the envelope. Divorce papers thick with immediate separation protocols. And behind them, heavier paper, federal seal, an official SEC subpoena demanding every personal and corporate financial record he had ever touched. David's knees buckled slightly. He looked up at Mitchell. His mouth opened and closed, like a suffocating fish. How he choked out. How did she get a private medevac? How did she get a federal subpoena in the middle of the night? Who gave her this? Mitchell smiled. A slow, predatory smile that made David take 1 step back. "You really have no idea who you married, do you?" Mitchell adjusted his briefcase. He stepped smoothly backward into the crowd of police officers. "Have a good evening, Mr. Chief Executive." The reporters descended on David like sharks. They stopped asking about the elevator. They started asking about federal investigations, about financial crimes, about the SEC. And David stood frozen under the burning television lights, holding a federal subpoena in his trembling hands as the first crack of his empire opened beneath his feet. Miles away, I was sitting up in a sterile white VIP medical suite with a heartbeat monitor thrumming steadily beside me. My daughter's tiny rhythmic pulse filled the room. I closed my eyes and pressed my hand against my belly, and I whispered a silent promise to her. I will never let anyone put us in the dark again. The heavy oak door swung open and Naomi walked in. My sister-in-law. Senior partner at one of the most feared litigation firms on the West Coast. Emerald green suit, stilettos clicking against the linoleum. Naomi did not practice corporate law, she weaponized it. She looked at the purple bruise blooming across my shoulder, and she did not rush to hug me. She walked to the foot of the bed. She set her briefcase down on the mattress. She met my eyes with pure cold fire. We do not cry over dead weight, she said. We liquidate it. Ryan walked in behind her carrying 2 protective cases. Within 10 minutes, my hospital suite was a war room. A Faraday cage. Encrypted routers. 3 portable monitors on the tray table. Ryan wiped my medical admission records from the central hospital database. He blacklisted David's phone number, his corporate accounts, his public relations team. For all practical purposes, I ceased to exist on the grid. We were not going to fight David. We were going to erase him. Naomi laid out the corporate filings across my hospital bed. She tapped a manicured nail against David's pre-IPO prospectus. He thinks his biggest problem is a damaged public image, she said. He has no idea his entire company is built on a fault line you control. He is 14 days from the NASDAQ. We are going to let him climb higher. I finished the sentence for her, and then we burned the ladder to the ground. Ryan cracked his knuckles. He turned to the center monitor. Claire, he said you left a dormant backdoor in their accounting software 3 years ago. It is time to wake it up. The infiltration took less than 4 minutes. Ryan sliced through the 2-factor authentication that David had bragged about in tech conferences. The screen shifted to the interface of the executive financial servers. We were inside. I directed him to the discretionary spending accounts assigned to the public relations department. If David and Savannah were hiding something, they would hide it in the noise of vendor invoices, and that is exactly where I found it. 7 vendors. Rounded invoice amounts. Perfect quarterly cadence. Real vendors do not bill in perfect 5-figure round numbers on the last day of every quarter. I told Ryan to run the routing numbers against the global banking registry. Naomi let out a low whistle. 7 shell companies, all registered to a single post office box in the Cayman Islands. None of them existed. Together they accounted for 40% of the public relations budget. Ryan traced the outbound flow. The money did not sit in the Caribbean. It moved back into the United States through a blind trust. He cracked the trust. He pulled the asset ledger. And there on the center monitor, glowing like a brand, it appeared. $4 million. A certified deed of trust for a custom-built luxury mountain estate. Aspen, Colorado. Primary beneficiary, Savannah. I stared at the screen. My husband had stolen $4 million from the company I saved and used it to buy his 26-year-old mistress a mountain house. He had taken the safety net I built for our daughter and handed it to the woman he chose to save in the elevator. Naomi zoomed in on the wire authorization codes. She smiled without warmth. He used his executive privilege to bypass the secondary approvals. That makes him solely liable under federal law. And Savannah is listed as managing director of every shell. That makes her a co-conspirator. They built their own graveyard. I felt a slow, cold smile touch my mouth. The elevator drop had almost broken my body. This discovery had just handed me the axe. The trap was set. And David was walking into it in a custom charcoal suit with a champagne flute in his hand. The heavy silence of our war room was shattered by voices in the corridor. Ryan snapped the evidence drive shut and locked the case. I already knew who it was. The SEC subpoena had frozen David's personal accounts and he was in a blind panic. I nodded to Ryan. Let him in. The door slammed open. David rushed inside, clutching a monstrous bouquet of white lilies. A hired photographer trailed him with a heavy flash camera. David dropped to his knees at the side of my bed and grabbed my hand with theatrical desperation. He buried his face in the blankets near my waist. The shutter clicked rapidly. "Claire," he cried, "thank God you are safe. I thought I lost you in that shaft." I did not pull my hand away. I did not scream. I stared down at him with eyes as cold and flat as black glass. "You have to understand why I did what I did," he whispered, pitched perfectly for the microphone. Savannah was hyperventilating. Her airways were closing. "I knew you were strong enough to wait. I did it because I believed in your strength." He was gaslighting me on camera. He was trying to convert his cowardice into a compliment. I said nothing. I did not blink. The silence stretched until the photographer shifted uncomfortably. David dropped the act. He snapped at the photographer to wait in the hall. The door clicked shut, and the moment we were alone, the grieving husband melted off his face. What replaced him was a cornered predator. "You think you are clever," he snarled, sending Mitchell down to the lobby with divorce papers and a federal subpoena. "My personal accounts were flagged this morning. Whatever stunt your lawyers pulled ends now." He threw a folder on my tray table, a marital voting proxy. He needed my signature to consolidate his voting shares before the initial public offering. "Sign it," he ordered. "Transfer your marital voting shares. Sign a non-disclosure about the elevator. Make a public statement that our separation is amicable." I stayed silent. His rage escalated. He leaned over the bed close enough that I could feel his breath on my face. He glanced down at my belly and lowered his voice to a poisonous whisper. "You are carrying a high-risk pregnancy, Claire. Your premium maternal care is tied to my corporate insurance. Sign this or I cancel your coverage by noon. You are an unemployed auditor going through a divorce. You have absolutely no leverage. Sign this or I promise you, and that baby will be on the street before nightfall." He smiled down at me. He genuinely believed he had cornered a helpless woman. He had no idea he had just handed my legal team the exact piece of leverage we needed to end him. I softened my shoulders. I lowered my gaze. I let one calibrated tear track down my cheek. I wrapped my arms around my belly and let my lip tremble. "Please do not cancel the insurance, David," I whispered in a broken voice. "The baby needs the specialists. Please. I will give you whatever you want." His predatory smile stretched wider. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his suit and dropped it on the tray. "Just sign on the dotted lines and play the estranged wife properly, and you get to keep your fancy doctors." I picked up the pen. I let my hand shake. I signed my name on the first page, then the second, then the third. Each scratch of the nib sounded very loud in the room. I pushed the folder back across the tray. David snatched it up. He scanned every signature. He tucked the folder into his jacket. He adjusted his cuffs. "Smart girl, Claire. Remember the script. Amicable separation. Stay off the radar until the IPO is finalized." The door clicked shut behind him. For 10 full seconds, no one moved. We listened to his shoes fading down the corridor. Then I wiped the tear off my cheek. My spine snapped back into place. Naomi pulled a duplicate copy of the proxy from her briefcase and dropped it on the mattress with a wolfish grin. "Give that man an Academy Award for supreme arrogance," she laughed. "He never let his own lawyer read the fine print." She flipped to page 4. Section 4, paragraph B. "I embedded a comprehensive moral turpitude and asset clawback provision. By signing this, David just legally bound his own personal estate to any future corporate fraud discoveries." I stared at the dense legal text. In a normal corporate structure, a chief executive is shielded by limited liability. Naomi's clause dissolved that shield the moment the majority shareholder acting under proxy was found guilty of embezzlement, wire fraud, or moral turpitude. He just tied a concrete block to his own ankles, I said. "Exactly," Naomi confirmed. "He thought he was taking your voting power. Instead, he legally consented to complete personal financial liquidation." David walked out of my hospital suite believing he had won. He had actually just signed his own execution warrant with a gold fountain pen. Across the city, Savannah was in her corner office trying to hold herself together. She was nursing a cup of artisanal coffee and applying concealer under her eyes. A sharp knock at the frosted glass door made her jolt. A courier in a charcoal suit stepped in. "No delivery uniform." He crossed her office in silence, placed a heavy black envelope on her keyboard, and left before she could open her mouth. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Document 1. A federal criminal audit mandate from the Internal Revenue Service. High priority. citing unexplained wealth and flagrant tax evasion linked to a luxury estate in Aspen, Colorado, naming Savannah as the sole managing director of the offshore holding entity that purchased it, demanding immediate forfeiture of financial records. Document 2. An 8x10 glossy photograph. Savannah and David walking through the sunlit entrance of a private Cayman Islands bank. Timestamp burned into the corner. The exact date and minute they had wired the stolen $4 million. She understood in a single heartbeat. She was not David's partner. She was his fall guy. She burst out of her office and stormed the executive suite. She slammed the papers onto his desk. "Look at this. Someone knows. Someone followed us." David barely glanced at them. "You are being hysterical, Savannah. It is just an automated tax inquiry. We will hire a tax attorney to bury them until after the bell rings." "Did you even look at the photograph?" she screamed. "Someone hired a private investigator to follow us to the Caribbean. If the board sees this, I go to federal prison." David grabbed her shoulders. "You need to calm down. I handled my wife yesterday. I have absolute control now. No one can touch me. Go back to your office and sell this IPO. If you panic and ruin my valuation, I will let them throw you to the wolves." She saw it then. The mask fell all the way off. He would let her burn. She backed out of his office slowly. Her survival instinct took over. She spent 2 hours pacing her rug. Then she checked his calendar. He had booked the executive boardroom for a private IPO rehearsal that afternoon. The perfect place to corner him. She marched down the corridor and threw the boardroom doors open. He was already at the head of the obsidian table. She slammed her hands on the surface. "I am not going to be pinned for this. You are going to tell your legal team you set up those shell companies. You are going to take the blame." He laughed. A harsh, empty sound. "Your signature is on the Cayman Bank files. You accepted the title of managing director. You enjoyed the private jets. You do not get to play the innocent victim now." "I only signed those papers because you told me it was a tax shelter," she shouted. "I did not know you were stealing capital from the investors." He pressed her back against the table. "Grow up. Where did you think $4 million came from? My salary. You knew what we were doing. I am the chief executive. My lawyers will paint you as a manipulative gold digger who embezzled corporate funds to finance her lifestyle. Who is a jury going to believe? The visionary founder or the girl sleeping with her boss?" She shoved him off. "You arrogant monster. I did not forge those wire transfers. You did. You bypassed the secondary approvals. You authorized the release of $4 million from the core development fund into the offshore accounts. I watched you type the authorization codes yourself." He lunged and grabbed her wrists. "Keep your voice down, you stupid girl. You have no proof. I wiped the server logs months ago. There is no digital footprint tying me to those authorizations. It is your word against mine, and your word means nothing." She wrenched free and ran out of the boardroom. David straightened his tie. He smoothed his jacket. He walked back to the projector, convinced his tracks were erased. He had forgotten one small architectural detail. The soundproof boardroom shared a ventilation shaft and an adjoining door with the office of the chief financial officer. On the other side of that door, Mitchell sat in the dark. The connecting door was cracked open exactly 1/2 inch. A digital audio recorder sat on his desk. When the argument ended, Mitchell reached out with a single finger and pressed stop. A green light blinked. The file was saved. He had captured every word. Savannah screaming. "You bypassed the secondary approvals." David boasting. "I wiped the server logs. I am legally insulated. My lawyers will paint you as a gold digger." A federal confession. A confession of embezzlement, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Mitchell uploaded the encrypted audio file to our secure channel and pressed send. The file landed on Ryan's monitors 15 seconds later. Naomi plugged in headphones. She listened. When it was over, she slowly took them off and looked across the hospital bed at me. Every piece was in place, the digital footprint, the lethal proxy. And now, David's own voice on tape confessing to federal crimes while framing his mistress. David was 48 hours from the NASDAQ. He was also 48 hours from federal handcuffs. He just did not know it yet. Naomi immediately pivoted the strategy to the corporate battlefield. The IPO was the crown jewel of David's ambition. We were going to shatter it from inside. She drafted a sterile, anonymous email to the private board of directors and the lead institutional underwriters handling the offering. Subject line: Urgent fiduciary risk assessment. Executive misconduct evidence attached. The attachment: unedited infrared security footage from the hidden camera mounted in the elevator ceiling, every second of the 8-hour ordeal, including the exact moment David shoved his pregnant wife against the steel wall, including the exact moment his heavy leather shoe kicked her in the shoulder as he climbed over her to escape. Across Seattle, billionaires opened the attachment expecting minor accounting complaints. Instead, they watched their chief executive officer trample a pregnant woman in high-definition infrared clarity. Wall Street investors do not care about marital fidelity. They care about radioactive liabilities. By the time the markets opened the next morning, the bleed had begun. Underwriters quietly pulled their commitments. Private equity firms canceled their preliminary buy-in orders. The Whisper network caught fire. David was in his corner office reviewing his press tour when his financial terminal flashed red. His pre-IPO valuation dropped 30% in 3 hours. Hundreds of millions of dollars evaporated. He smashed the intercom. Every underwriter call went to voicemail. Every board email came back as an automated out of office. The silence was deafening. Panic finally reached his chest. Without institutional backing, the IPO would collapse before he ever reached the trading floor. He would be left holding massive corporate debt with no capital to service it. He paced. He barked orders. He directed his remaining finance team to secure emergency bridge funding. He spent the entire afternoon on desperate, sweating phone calls to shadow equity firms. He was willing to sign away the soul of his company just to keep the illusion alive. From my hospital bed, I watched his desperation on Ryan's monitors. He was bleeding out. He was negotiating terrible deals. He was taking on toxic debt. He genuinely believed he was fighting the ruthless mechanics of the free market. He had no idea he was dancing on a string. He had no idea the shadow firms he was begging for capital were all controlled by my blind trust. The next morning, David walked into the boardroom in a wrinkled suit with dark circles under his eyes. He was operating on espresso and unfiltered panic. His finance team had lined up an emergency video conference with an aggressive holding firm that provided bridge loans to distressed assets, a faceless entity that swooped in when traditional banks slammed their doors. He forced a confident smile onto his face as the video call connected. On the screen, 3 elite corporate attorneys sat in a sterile gray conference room, expressions blank. David launched into his pitch. Market disruption, exponential user acquisition, unprecedented revenue projections. He painted his valuation collapse as a minor market correction. A brief hiccup. The lead attorney cut him off mid-sentence. "We are fully aware of your lack of institutional backing," the attorney said. "Your valuation dropped 30% overnight. We are not interested in your speeches. We are interested in leverage." The term sheet was brutal. Exorbitant interest. A highly aggressive convertible debt instrument. If the stock fell below a specific threshold or if any executive misconduct triggered a regulatory review, the debt would convert immediately into commanding equity. To secure funds today, David also had to sign over a massive chunk of his personal founder shares at a valuation slashed by 60%. It was financial extortion. It was designed to strip him the moment he stumbled. David sat alone in the empty boardroom staring at the contract on his tablet. Sweat tracked down the side of his face. He knew the terms were suicidal for a chief executive, but his ego could not stomach canceling the IPO. He convinced himself he was a genius. He convinced himself he could outmaneuver these faceless lawyers once the public capital hit his accounts next week. He picked up his stylus. He signed. In my hospital suite, the encrypted monitors chirped a soft confirming ping. Naomi leaned back in her chair and laughed. A deep, resonant laugh. Ryan grinned and locked the transfer into our servers. David had no idea who he had just pitched to. The shadowy holding firm was a subsidiary of the Vanguard Angel Fund, entirely controlled, funded, and operated by my blind trust. I had watched the live feed of his desperate pitch. I had listened to my husband beg for capital from the very woman he had kicked in the shoulder and left to burn. He walked out of that boardroom wiping sweat from his brow, believing he had saved his empire. He had just handed me the last keys to his kingdom. I already owned the seed funding that built his software. Through Naomi's proxy trap, I legally bound his personal estate to his coming criminal charges. And through this emergency bridge loan, I now owned his massive debt and his foundational equity. I held his entire existence in my palm. The IPO would go forward. It would just no longer be a celebration. It would be his execution. And I would be the one holding the axe. The morning of the initial public offering dawned crisp and clear over the Seattle skyline. David had rented out a massive, opulent grand hall in the heart of the financial district for a remote NASDAQ bell-ringing ceremony. He spared no expense. A red carpet stretched to the curb. Velvet ropes, towering white orchids. Black luxury vehicles lined the street. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with expensive cologne and unlimited wealth. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated with champagne flutes and imported caviar. A massive digital marquee dominated the front wall. A countdown clock ticked toward the opening bell. David stood at the center of the room in a brand-new custom charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. His hair was perfect. The desperate man who had signed away his empire 48 hours earlier was completely gone. He held a flute of vintage champagne and boasted to financial reporters about his relentless grind and singular genius. He believed his own lies. Savannah stood next to him in a form-fitting crimson designer dress. Her hair and makeup had been done by an elite styling team. Despite the terror still crawling under her skin from the federal audit notice, she forced a radiant, practiced smile onto her face. She had convinced herself that the flood of public market capital would wash away every one of her legal problems. They stood together on the elevated podium, a picture-perfect monument to greed and deception. Mitchell stood quietly at the edge of the podium holding a glass of sparkling water, expression neutral. David threw an arm around him for a photograph and loudly praised him as the best numbers guy in the business. Mitchell allowed the photograph with a polite, tight-lipped smile. He knew exactly what was about to happen. The countdown clock dropped below the 10-minute mark. David stepped up to the primary microphone. He tapped it. The room fell quiet. He launched into a sweeping speech about innovation, courage, and the future of technology. He thanked his dedicated team. He entirely omitted the wife who had funded the foundational code. He thanked Savannah by name and called her the voice of the company. I monitored the live feed from a luxury transport idling 2 blocks away. Naomi sat beside me, smoothing the lapels of her sharp legal suit. Ryan sat in the front seat, murmuring into an earpiece, coordinating with our security team already positioned around the perimeter. David raised his champagne flute high. He toasted to the future. He toasted to himself. The crowd erupted. Savannah beamed and placed a hand on his arm. They believed they had climbed to the pinnacle of the corporate world without a single consequence. The countdown clock dropped to 5 minutes. It was time. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand hall burst apart with a resounding crash. Every head snapped around. The flashbulbs of the financial press halted. In the sudden flood of daylight from the lobby, the silhouette of a pregnant woman filled the entryway. I stepped over the threshold. I was no longer the broken, weeping woman David had kicked to the floor of a burning elevator shaft. I was a senior forensic auditor, and I had come to collect. I wore a sharply tailored midnight blue power suit. The fabric accommodated my 7-month baby bump and turned my pregnancy from a point of vulnerability into a display of undeniable strength. My chin was high, my spine was steel. I locked my eyes onto the man on the podium. Behind me walked Naomi and Ryan. They flanked me like a lethal royal guard. The grand hall descended into absolute silence. The soft jazz died. The only sound left in the world was the rhythmic, deliberate click of my heels, striking the polished marble as I marched down the length of the red carpet. The sea of wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and Wall Street journalists parted from me. They did not know who I was. The authority radiating off my body told them I owned the room. David froze. The triumphant smile literally melted off his face. The microphone slipped in his hand. He stared at me like a man watching a ghost climb out of a grave. In his mind, I was supposed to be somewhere hiding, weeping over our broken marriage. The sight of me marching toward his stage, flanked by a corporate attorney and a private security expert, shattered his reality. Savannah shrank back against the digital marquee. Her crimson dress suddenly looked cheap under the harsh lights. Her survival instinct kicked in, and she took a step away from David. The journalists smelled blood. Cameras pivoted from the podium to me. Flashbulbs erupted like rapid-fire explosions. The countdown clock dropped to 4 minutes. David gripped the podium with white knuckles. He covered the microphone with his hand and hissed at the venue's security team. "Security, remove this woman from the premises immediately. She is my estranged wife, and she is currently experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Escort her out before she hurts herself." It was his classic move. When threatened, he weaponized my pregnancy. He tried to paint me as hysterical. 4 massive corporate security guards stepped onto the red carpet and moved to block my path. David exhaled with relief. His authority as chief executive would carry the day. I did not stop walking. From the edge of the elevated stage, Mitchell stepped out of the shadows. Calm, calculated, absolute authority. He did not yell. He simply raised one hand, palm outward, toward the advancing security team. A single silent gesture. The 4 guards stopped dead. They lowered their hands and stepped back. They parted down the middle to clear my path. In the corporate world, loyalty belongs to the person who signs the paychecks. Mitchell controlled payroll, and Mitchell knew exactly who actually funded the company. David gripped the podium with knuckles bone white. "What are you doing?" he hissed into the microphone, completely abandoning his polished persona. "I gave you a direct order. Remove that woman from the building. She is trespassing." Mitchell did not even look at him. He kept his eyes respectfully on me and lowered his head in a slight acknowledging nod. I resumed my march. The click of my heels echoed through the cavernous hall like the ticking of an execution timer. I reached the base of the podium steps. Ryan planted himself at the bottom of the staircase. Naomi ascended beside me. I climbed the steps, slowly. I felt the last 3 years lifting off my shoulders, the late nights over forensic spreadsheets, the fertility treatments, the 8 hours in the smoke. All of it fueled my ascent. I reached the top of the platform and stepped directly into David's personal space. The height difference between us suddenly did not matter. He tried to puff out his chest. His body betrayed him. I could see the terrified pulse beating in his neck. He smelled like fear masked by expensive cologne. I reached the microphone stand. He gripped the metal with both hands, trying to physically bar me. His eyes pleaded, a pathetic, silent begging. "Claire, please," he whispered. "Do not do this. We can talk about everything at home. Just walk away." I wrapped my hand around the microphone. I ripped it out of his sweating grip. The sudden feedback screeched over the sound system. Several board members in the front row covered their ears. I turned my body and squared myself at the center of the podium. The sea of Wall Street journalists, institutional investors, and corporate partners stared up at me in absolute bewilderment. The flashing cameras had stopped. The room held its breath. I let the silence stretch. Then I lifted the microphone to my lips. "You cannot order security to remove the primary stakeholder of this company, David." The words slammed into the grand hall like a physical shockwave. The room fell dead silent. A pin drop would have sounded like a gunshot. The Wall Street reporters froze. The institutional investors in the front row stiffened in their tailored suits. The narrative they had been fed for months was shredded in a single sentence. David let out a choked, suffocated gasp. He staggered backward like I had physically shoved him. He bumped into the digital marquee. His mouth hung open. His brain desperately tried to process the impossible word. Stakeholder. Primary stakeholder. The silence held for exactly 3 seconds. Then absolute chaos erupted. 50 reporters shouted over each other. Camera flashes turned the grand hall into a blinding strobe. Cell phones came out. Industry insiders frantically dialed their trading desks. The board of directors leapt out of their velvet chairs. I stood perfectly still in the center of the storm. I raised the microphone again. I did not need to raise my voice. The room went silent. "My name is Claire," I said. "For the past 5 years, I have been known publicly only as David's wife. But in the corporate registry, and more importantly, in the federal tax records, I hold a very different title." I turned to the board of directors in the front row. Their expensive suits could not hide their trembling. 3 years ago, this startup was hemorrhaging capital. You were weeks away from insolvency. Your prototype was crashing. Your creditors were circling. And then an anonymous entity known as the Vanguard Angel Fund appeared with a $15 million injection. David stood before you and took all the credit. He told you his pitching skills had secured the investment of a lifetime. I turned to look at David. He was shaking his head in slow, jerky movements. He lied, I said. There was no pitch. There was no negotiation. I am the sole controller of the Vanguard Angel Fund. I authorized that $15 million wire transfer from my private blind trust. I built a financial foundation of this entire empire while he took the applause. Gasps rippled through the audience. Journalists typed furiously on their smartphones, verifying the corporate registrations in real time. But I did not just provide the money, I said. David likes to claim he is a software genius. He likes to tell the press he coded the foundational algorithm in our garage. That is another convenient fiction. I am a forensic auditor. I wrote the core algorithm that processes your financial data. I hold the exclusive intellectual property rights to the source code. David finally found his voice, a pathetic high-pitched squeak. You are lying, he choked out, clutching his chest. The company owns the code. We filed the patents. I smiled. A cold, predatory expression that made him flinch. You filed patents for the user interface, David. You never owned the engine. I licensed the core algorithm to this company under a strict 3-year usage agreement. That agreement had an automatic renewal clause, provided the chief executive officer physically signed the extension forms. Those were the tax documents I brought to your office the morning of the elevator crash. You were too busy kissing your mistress to read them. Too arrogant to sign them properly. I paused. The license officially expired at midnight. As of this morning, I legally own 60% of your entire operational infrastructure. And you are currently running unlicensed, stolen software. The lead underwriter from the investment bank stood up, his face drained of color. You promised us clean intellectual property, he shouted at David. You guaranteed the code was unencumbered. He never understood the business he was supposedly running, I said, cutting the banker off. But his incompetence does not stop there. I took a step closer to David. He pressed himself harder against the digital screen. Savannah wept silently in the corner. 2 days ago, I continued when the institutional investors began pulling their capital. He panicked. He signed a highly aggressive convertible debt agreement with a shadow-holding firm. He traded away massive equity at a slashed valuation just to keep today's ceremony alive. I watched the exact moment realization hit him. His eyes widened. His jaw dropped. Yes, David. I whispered directly to him, though. The microphone carried it to the room. The shadow firm that purchased your toxic debt is a subsidiary of my trust. You signed over the remaining 40% of your personal equity directly to me. I own your debt. I own your algorithm. I own your future. The humiliation was absolute. David slumped against the podium. His legs gave out. He slid down the polished wood and collapsed onto his knees on the stage in front of the entire financial press corps. The arrogant tech titan. The man who had threatened to cancel my health insurance. Completely obliterated. He stared up at me from the floor with hollow eyes. Naomi stepped forward to fill the space I had vacated. She unclasped her leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of legal files. She slammed them onto the wooden podium. The booming thud echoed through the grand hall like a guillotine dropping. David flinched. Naomi did not look at him. She looked at the 3 men in navy suits with federal identification badges in the front row. The senior regulators from the Securities and Exchange Commission on site to monitor the offering. Gentlemen of the Securities and Exchange Commission, she announced. My name is Naomi and I represent the Vanguard Angel Fund. As the primary shareholder of this corporation, we are officially halting this initial public offering effective immediately. A collective gasp ripped through the room. The lead Nasdaq representative grabbed his red radio receiver and barked frantic orders to the trading floor in New York. On the massive screen behind us, the countdown clock froze. The glowing corporate logo shattered into a static gray error screen. The dream was dead. Naomi pressed her hands flat against the podium. The Vanguard Fund is halting this public offering because we are formally triggering the embezzlement and moral turpitude clawback clause embedded in the Chief Executive Officer's proxy agreement. David let out a wounded guttural noise. Over the past 18 months, Naomi continued, her voice slicing through the silence. David has utilized his executive authority to bypass secondary financial approvals. He has systematically siphoned $4 million of investor capital out of the Core Development Fund. He has routed this capital through a network of fraudulent shell companies registered to a post office box in the Cayman Islands. Angry shouts rose from the institutional investors. The final destination for these stolen funds was not operational development, Naomi said, gesturing sharply toward the corner of the stage where Savannah was weeping. The $4 million was laundered back into the United States to purchase a luxury mountain estate in Aspen, Colorado, an estate deeded entirely to his public relations director. We possess the digital server logs, the forged wire transfers, and the offshore banking records. All evidence has been submitted to the federal authorities. David scrambled up. That is a lie, he shouted, his voice cracking. Savannah did that. She set up the accounts. I did not know. Naomi did not blink. She pulled a small digital audio player from her pocket. She held it against the microphone. She hit a single button. The crystal-clear audio of David's voice flooded the grand hall. I wiped the server logs months ago. There's no digital footprint tying me to those authorizations. It is your word against mine, and your word means nothing. The undeniable confession hung in the air. Therefore, Naomi announced turning off the recording because the chief executive officer signed a direct proxy agreement 2 days ago. He legally waived his corporate limited liability. The corporate veil has been officially pierced. The Vanguard Fund is executing immediate total asset liquidation. David gripped his chest. What does that mean? He gasped. What are you doing to me? It means you own absolutely nothing, Naomi answered coldly. As of this exact second, every one of your personal bank accounts has been frozen by federal mandate. Your investment portfolios are locked. The deed to your luxury penthouse is seized. Your luxury vehicles are being towed from the corporate parking garage. Every dollar you have ever earned is now collateral for the $4 million you stole from your investors. David pulled his smartphone from his pocket with shaking fingers. He opened his mobile banking application. The screen refreshed. Where millions of dollars had sat 1 hour ago, there was now zero. Several accounts displayed negative balances due to immediate clawback penalties. He looked at the custom suit he was wearing. He suddenly realized it was the only thing of value he had left in the world. The whine of sirens outside the venue shattered the silence. The lobby lights flashed red and blue through the glass walls. The heavy oak doors thrust open one final time. A dozen federal agents in dark FBI windbreakers stormed into the room. They fanned out with military precision. The lead agent marched directly down the center aisle with a thick stack of warrants in his hand. Savannah broke. Her fragile composure shattered. She let out a raw, hysterical shriek and lunged across the podium. She swung her open palm with unhinged momentum. It connected with David's cheek in a brutal, ringing slap that echoed across the hall. He forced me to launder the money, she screamed, pointing at him. It was his idea. He bypassed the secondary approvals. He told me to sign the Cayman Island documents and promised it was just a tax shelter. I did not know he was stealing from the investors. He set me up to take the fall. David lunged and grabbed her wrists. Shut your mouth, you stupid girl. You are ruining everything. They struggled against the backdrop of their own ruined offering, fighting like rats in a sinking cage. The Wall Street journalists pressed closer. Flashbulbs fired in a relentless storm. The federal agents did not wait for the argument to end. They bounded up the podium steps. 2 agents grabbed David by the shoulders and slammed him chest first against the wooden podium he had used to boast about his genius 10 minutes earlier. His arms were wrenched behind his back. The cold metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheted tight around his wrists. Another pair of agents surrounded Savannah. She collapsed to her knees, weeping and begging the officers to look at her phone. The lead federal agent stepped up to the microphone. David, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act. Savannah, you are under arrest for money laundering and accessory to major financial fraud. He recited their Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." David could not speak. The man who loved the sound of his own voice more than anything on earth was rendered entirely mute. The agents began to march them down the steps. Savannah was walked out first. Her hysterical sobbing echoed over the noise. As she passed the front row of institutional investors, the very people she had tried to charm turned their backs on her. Then it was David's turn. The two agents flanking him marched him down the center aisle straight toward the exit where I stood waiting. I did not move. As David approached, a bottleneck of aggressive journalists surged forward, temporarily blocking the exit doors. The federal agents had to halt for a brief moment to clear the path. This delay stopped David directly in front of me. Less than 3 feet. He slowly raised his head. The man looking back at me was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant titan I had married. His custom suit was torn at the shoulder, stained with sweat, and the artificial soot he had smeared on his forehead for sympathy the night of the crash. His perfect hair was matted. His eyes were wide, frantic, and hollow. His gaze dropped to my belly. A violent shudder ripped through his body. He realized with crushing clarity that he had traded his family, his freedom, and his future for a fleeting illusion of power that I had controlled the entire time. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the red carpet at my feet. The agents grabbed his shoulders to haul him up. He resisted. He let his body go limp, so he stayed on the floor. The reporters gasped. Cameras fired in a frenzied symphony of light. David looked up at me from his knees. Tears streamed freely down his face, cutting clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. "Claire, please," he begged in a ragged voice. "I made a mistake. I am so sorry. Please, you have to stop this. You control the funds. You can tell the federal agents this is a misunderstanding. I will give you everything. I will sign whatever you want. Just do not let them put me in a cage." I stared down at him in absolute silence. When I did not respond, he played his final card. He nodded toward my stomach. He tried to use the child he had abandoned in a burning elevator as a bargaining chip. "For the sake of our unborn child, Claire," he pleaded in a whine. "Our baby needs a father. You cannot let our child grow up knowing their father is locked away in a federal prison. Please, I am begging you, for the baby." The sheer audacity did not spark anger. It only made me colder. I looked down at him. The flashing camera lights lit up his tear-streaked face. All I saw was the heavy steel hatch slamming shut in the dark above me. I took one deliberate step closer to him. The federal agents tensed. Ryan raised a single hand and held them back for one final moment. I looked directly into David's terrified eyes. My voice was low. It carried a chilling, lethal resonance that cut perfectly through the noise of the grand hall. "When you stepped on my shoulder in that elevator and left us to die in the dark, you severed your rights as a father." Every word dripped with ice. "Enjoy your new life in a much smaller, much colder box." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The last flicker of hope in his eyes was extinguished. He let out a loud, agonizing wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him. Behind me, the federal agents hauled him to his feet. He thrashed weakly as they dragged him out into the freezing rain. His agonizing cries faded slowly. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, permanently sealing his fate. 6 months passed. The justice system moves with lethal efficiency when faced with undeniable evidence of federal crimes. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the United States District Court, watching the final sentencing play out. David stood before the federal judge, stripped of his custom suits and arrogant smirk. He wore a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. His posture was slouched, his shoulders rounded in permanent defeat. The judge showed no leniency. The gavel fell with a heavy echoing thud. 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. No early parole. No special treatment. No redemption. Savannah's separate hearing came 2 days later. 5 years in federal prison for money laundering and accessory to major financial fraud. The court authorized the complete forfeiture of the Aspen estate, the designer wardrobes, and the offshore accounts. All of it returned to the defrauded startup investors. She wept as the bailiffs let her out. Under Mitchell's steady leadership as the new chief executive, and with my strict guidance from the head of the executive board, the software startup stabilized. We cleaned the ledgers. We rebuilt investor trust. We launched a new initial public offering on our own precise terms. It emerged stronger and completely untethered from the dark shadow of David's reign. But my greatest victory had nothing to do with stock valuations. My greatest victory happened on a quiet, sunlit morning in a serene maternity ward. The atmosphere in the delivery room was the exact opposite of that black, suffocating elevator. Warm light spilled through the window. Soft music played somewhere behind me. A nurse held my hand and told me to breathe. And then finally, after the longest push of my life, I heard it. A cry, strong, fierce, full of life. I gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Bright eyes. 10 tiny, perfect fingers. 10 tiny, perfect toes. They placed her against my bare chest, still slick and warm. And I felt her heartbeat press against mine, for the very first time outside my body. I bent my head down and I whispered against her damp forehead the promise I had made her in the dark 8 months earlier. I will never let anyone put us in the dark again. And she wrapped one tiny hand around my finger like she understood every word. That was the exact moment my true life began. Now listen to me. If you are watching this and you have ever been abandoned by the one person who swore to protect you, if you have ever poured your love, your money, your silence, and your loyalty into someone who used it as a weapon against you, if you have ever been made to feel small, quiet, forgettable, and easy to discard, I need you to hear me. You are not weak. You are not naive. You are not the sum of what they did to you in the dark. The very traits they mocked you for. The patience, the kindness, the quiet mind that watches everything and remembers everything. Those are not flaws. Those are weapons. And one day, when the moment comes, and it will come, you will pick them up, and you will use them, and the same people who left you bleeding on the floor will find themselves on their knees in front of the very woman they thought they buried. They chose a shorter life for a bigger crown. You choose a longer life. You choose your peace. You choose your child. You choose you. If this story reached something inside you that you have been holding down for a very long time, do something for me right now. Type the word survived in the comments below. Just that one word. So every other woman scrolling past this video tonight can see how many of us there are. So she knows she is not alone in the dark. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so the next story finds you the moment it goes live. Smash the like button so more women who need to hear this get it in their feed tonight. And tell me in the comments what you would have said to David on his knees. I read every single one. Your peace is coming. Your daughter is coming. Your morning is coming. Stay with me. I have more stories waiting for you.